Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the first lifelong all staff training in this health equity and social change project. My name is Linda Chasteen, and I'm the HIV program coordinator for African Americans Reach and Teach Health, or as we're known in the community, ARTH. We are a small Black woman and femme run organization based out of Renton. And we have two main programs. One of our programs is community-based. We work with African American and POC elders, those living with chronic conditions and their caregivers and families. We serve them by offering health-centered and culturally specific educational and communal opportunities to gather and to learn and to be in community with one another. And then we have the HIV program, which I run, which we work with clinics and other health organizations, as well as community-based organizations and administrative service organizations to establish and create an environment for an organizational development process. Or we also do free community training as well around topics that are associated with health equity and social change. And some of our areas of expertise are diversity, equity, inclusion training and consulting, historical trauma and the impacts on our lived experiences today and our care today, leadership development, team and trust building, healing and reconciliation, and all kinds of decolonizing frameworks. And what we do is connect you all with experts in the field, consultants and teachers and folks who are actually working in their field as counselors, healers, and equity consultants to be able to provide you all this education and opportunity for growth. Our philosophy is that we work on each individual person and give them the space and opportunity to have their own internal realizations and evolutions. And then we work as a community to build and restore our interpersonal relationships. And from there, we are able to work together to create change for the entire organization, which ultimately trickles down to the care of your clients, right? The functionality and the health of and well-being of your clients, which is the purpose of you all being here and being a part of the lifelong community. Sorry, I'm looking over to the side. I have to let people in at the same time. So I hope I gave a good overview. So I'm very excited for you all to witness the consultant for today or the teacher for today. I want to introduce them. Makayala, Wright is a Midwest, is a Midwest transplant from Leavenworth, Kansas. They study sociology and psychology at Smith College and have a master's in social work from Case Western Reserve University. They have spent much of their career working with youth in a variety of capacities. They have also worked with gender diverse populations and have practiced as a therapist, worked as a grant writer and communications manager, and managed housing, domestic violence, and victim of crime programs. They have in-depth experience serving as a lead organizer and manager of youth programs and have advocated for youth and young adults of color in King County and nationally through Opportunity Youth United and the Aspen Institute. In their spare time, Makayala enjoys writing and editing a blog about the Black experience in America called Makayala Writes. So I introduce to you all Makayala.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Linda. And thank you everyone for being here today. I recognize that it is a Wednesday morning, that you all do a lot of heavy and really important work in community. And so thank you for taking 2 hours of your time to listen to me talk about community and healing and justice. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint. So give me a moment. If I look like I'm struggling a little bit, it's just that I'm using a Mac and I am more of a PC person typically, but trying to make do with what I have for today, and to make sure that I'm meeting people's needs. So let me put this into presentation mode so that you all don't have to see everything from the side. There we go. So creating collective care, accountability, equity, belonging. So for today, what we'll be going over is a lot of what I like to call foundational skills, that we can then apply to the training that we'll be doing for next month, and go more in depth about equity. And so one thing I want to say, I know it says racial equity, but when I say racial equity, I also want to add in that I also think that it's important to talk about equity from other perspectives as well, including race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever it might be. Okay, I see someone's having audio issues. I hope that it works out, Amber. Okay, so moving into this next slide. Just reminders and norms. I know that we've all been on Zoom at this point for almost 2 years now. This is what work is looking like for a lot of us. But I always like to put out reminders just because I know that different people do different things. And I also feel like it's important to talk about these things just from a place of accessibility and accommodation. And so these are just reminders to keep in mind. Please be sure to mute yourself unless you're speaking. And that's just because I've sometimes seen people accidentally unmute themselves and people overhear conversations. And I don't want anyone to be embarrassed on this Wednesday morning, or to have people overhear things that maybe they didn't want people to hear. Also turn on your cameras if you are able, if you enjoy doing that, especially during the breakout rooms that we'll be doing later. I also recognize though that turning on the camera might not be an option for everyone. Maybe your energy's low, maybe your camera's not working. It's totally okay. And so that goes into point 3, which is if you're not a big fan of your camera, definitely use your chat box. And I would say even for the people who are on camera to use their chat box. I feel like it's an underutilized resource sometimes in the Zoom space. It's one that I love. I consider myself to be someone who's a very big fan of using my chat box whenever I'm in trainings. Like I love it. I also love when people use the reactions like thumbs up or like celebration emojis, whatever it might be, just so that we're really able to engage with one another and to uplift one another. And so the chat is definitely a resource. And so do not be afraid to use it. I love reading the chat as I'm talking through different points. And so like at any point, if any of you have a question or anything, definitely put it in the chat, or use your reaction emojis that we have. Yeah, absolutely. I really love the reaction button. So these are just some reminders. This is just also me letting you all know like what I like to do as a facilitator when I am in the digital space with folks. And so let me go ahead and move into the next portion. Also, I have a cat, just so that you all know. So if you all hear a meow at any point or you see a cat right next to me, it's because she's very friendly. She likes to say hi. And so my apologies if she's distracting, but also she does like people. And so, yeah, you all are welcome to greet the cat. Her name is Tapia. So let me move to the next slide. This is just our structure. Yes, Octavia, named for Octavia Butler. But our workshop structure for today, what we'll be focusing on mainly is creating a group norm. I think it's important, especially when we're having conversations about boundaries and other important things around equity, that we make sure that we're creating a norm so that people feel safe in this space and feel like they can fully show up and be present in a way that honors their identities and doesn't feel like it's unsafe in any kind of way. And so I definitely encourage you all to be very open and letting me know and letting others in this space know what you all need as we're sitting that group agreement. We'll also be going over some boundary setting and exploration and just talking about boundaries and how we can better be able to communicate our boundary needs in the workplace, especially because that does translate a lot into our work as caregivers within community. We'll also talk about mindfulness and just like how to apply mindfulness skills to listening to each other, existing with one another, being able to actually describe our emotions and to acknowledge that, yes, it's true, we do have emotions. We cannot leave them at the door when we clock in, because that's part of the human experience, is experiencing emotions. And so how do we address that, especially in terms of making an equitable and safe workspace? And lastly, we'll start to touch on how to have healthy conversations, though the bulk of that conversation around healthy conversations will take place next month, but we'll be setting the stage for that and really trying to put those pieces together. So that's just a little bit of the agenda for today. And so with that, let's move into the next portion, which is about me. So I'm glad that Linda was able to go over about me, but this is just the same thing that was mentioned just on a PowerPoint slide. And so I am a Midwest transplant. I have lived out here for roughly 6 years now. I've lived on the East Coast also, have family from the South. So I've been in multiple regions of this country at this point, and really enjoy living on the West Coast, honestly. And even though my work experience has mostly been with youth, I honestly consider myself to be a social worker who operates along the lifespan continuum. I also consider myself to be someone who works with folks from all different sorts of walks of life and backgrounds. And so if you pick a group, I probably have worked with them at some point. I really just enjoy working with people and supporting them and meeting them where they're at, and really trying to figure out how can we create a safe environment for everyone. And not just safe, but one that encourages people to thrive and to really be in tune with themselves. And so, oh, that's cool. That's just someone else from Kansas. You'll have to let me know what city you're from. But yeah, so that's just a little about me. But we'll go ahead and move into the next portion. Also, thank you all for using the chat. I really am enjoying the comments. So with this, we'll go into group agreements. So I have a notebook. I'll make sure to keep note. I'll also put some of these agreements in the chat and capture it so that we can return back to it throughout this session, and also for our next one that we're doing in February. But what I definitely encourage you all to do is just to really think about what you need in order to feel supported in this space. And to also even start thinking about like, what are the sort of boundaries that you like to have in place, or agreements that you like to have when you're discussing things like emotions, or just things about your identity, or things that just feel deeply personal. And so I'm going to pause and give folks a chance to either unmute themselves or to add to the chat. But just thinking about what agreements would be helpful for you, or what agreements have you enjoyed in the past when you've done these sort of workshops. Okay, let me look at the chat. Yeah, allow people to speak without interruption. Absolutely. Respectfulness of others, keeping confidentiality, be brave, lean into discomfort, be willing to share difficult info, be open, absolutely. Honesty. Let me actually start noting some of these things. So I see openness as a theme that's coming up, and honesty. I also see trust, which I really love. Respect, absolutely. Asking questions, not demanding answers. Yes, that is true. Allow others to speak. Empathy, yes. Thank you for that, Omar. Listening, yes. Yes, patience. Using I statements. Absolutely. And let me make sure I did not miss any. I see being unapologetic and realizing some are going through a decolonization, that for some going through a decolonization process, maybe traumatic, absolutely. Yeah, just acknowledging the fact that this is really hard work for everyone, right? Like, because it requires us acknowledging a lot of things that are truths, but truths that we often don't speak aloud, especially in our society. Yes. Being willing to share. I definitely want to acknowledge that be brave and lean into discomfort, because that's a lot of what I'll be trying to teach us today, which is why we're talking about emotions. Um, because I think that it's a defense mechanism, right, for us to kind of shy away from things when we have discomfort. It makes sense. Like in the wild, before we had the society that we had, if we had alarm bells ringing that something was unsafe, it ensured our safety. You know, it made sure that we weren't like being attacked by dangerous things like wild animals or whatever it might have been. I think what's hard about that is having a conversation about equity or identity is not going to harm us physically, but our brains don't know that. And so it can be really tricky to be able to have these conversations. And I think a lot of it comes down to also being able to recognize your own boundaries. But we'll get more into that as we move on. But let me scroll down to make sure I did not miss anything. Okay, perfect. So what I will also do is I will save these responses. And after this training, I will probably turn them into something really wonderful to look at, so that we have that on our slides for the next training that we get into. But I just want to pause and see like if there are any thoughts that are coming up for people before we get into the bulk of what we'll be talking about for today. Like any questions, just like concerns, anything that I need to know. And it's okay if there's no answer immediately. You all are also welcome to message me privately and to let me know anything. It could be related to needs, accommodations, maybe questions you all might have. And I promise I really, really like questions. I've had a lot of jobs throughout my work experience because I really enjoy learning. And I've found that going into different types of work allowed me to be able to absorb more information. And so one of those jobs I had was being a teacher at one point for 7th graders, which requires a lot of patience in answering the questions. And so y'all are welcome to toss anything at me. I will not be bothered by it. I promise I will get to your question. If I don't have a full answer, I'll probably try to seek it out or to find someone who can answer that question for you all. But let's go ahead and move into the training. So I'm a real big fan of covering broad concepts with people and not just jumping immediately into the meat. I feel like what I've noticed with a lot of equity trainings that can go left is that oftentimes we don't talk about the skills that it requires for us to be able to talk about equity or to be able to talk about safety in the workplace. I think that we sometimes forget that there are building blocks that go into these skills. And I think some of us have these skills and that's great. Like if we had parents who taught us how to listen well or how to validate people or how to recognize our boundaries, but this isn't true for everyone. And so knowing that, I started to put this together. And this is also based off of a lot of the work experience that I've done as a therapist, but also as someone who worked with youth and have worked in community agency sittings. And so a lot of this training, even though the words, you might not see the words equity when I'm talking about boundaries, I would encourage you all to really consider how things like boundaries or values or mindfulness are skills that can lend to having conversations around equity or consent or serving community or just being able to actually fully show up as yourself. And Erica, you're totally fine about the technology issues. I totally get it. I was having tech issues myself and I'm on a different laptop than I typically would use. But all that to say, these are a lot of like building block skills that we'll be utilizing. And so if some of these feel familiar to you all, I definitely encourage you to like high five yourself and to feel proud because that means that at some point, either you had a therapist who taught you these things or you did that work yourself. But I think what will be helpful is thinking about how can we apply these sort of foundational skills like listening and being able to speak our truth and being able to just recognize your emotions and your needs as a person in the workplace. How can we apply it to being able to create just and equitable spaces of community care. Because I think that's something that's really hard for us, especially folks who are so used to serving others. It can be really hard for us to recognize that there's work that we also have to do for ourselves, and that work really does trickle down into how we in turn serve our community. So absolutely, James, I'm just looking at your comment about language as well. Terms of language use change over time. Yeah, so I'm just gonna pause and see if anyone just has any thoughts, any questions, like anything that they want to toss in the chat before I move into our first topic for today, which is boundaries.
Makayala, I made that statement more in terms of like skills. I think for some of us who, have like major education and all that stuff, the language that's used is different than some people's level of language and ability to communicate some of the things that are happening for them, or their ability to verbalize feelings or thoughts.
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand you. So do you mean that depending on the context and the person, they might be using different terms to describe the same thing?
Yes.
Yes.
And also, like, and I'll just use myself as an example. I was born in the early 60s, and so I'm used to having heard different words referring to different populations over time, and so that people's language might not have caught up with the place that we're at today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for naming that. And that's something that resonates for me, and that I recognize as someone who was born in Leavenworth, Kansas. The language there is very different than the language that is used on this particular coast. Sometimes it takes a little bit to catch up and some learning, right? And having grace and compassion for self, but also for the others who might be a little confused, or who might, I don't want to use the word triggered, but be alarmed, like if there's misunderstandings come up. And so I'll tuck that away, because I think that that's a good example, and it'll come up a lot, especially as we get more into communication and talking about that. Yes, and so let me go ahead and move forward. So we will be using breakout rooms. I know some people love them, some people are about them. It really depends, but just knowing that we have a lot of people in this training, I really want people to have a space to actually process and discuss some of these things, especially for the more shy or introverted folks in this space, because I also identify as an introvert, believe it or not. And so I think it's really important to give people multiple different ways to be able to process and reflect and think through things. And so this breakout room, I'll give you all around 10 minutes. If that feels like it's too long, you all are definitely welcome to send a message out, and I can close the breakout rooms at any point. But I'll just be putting 2 people per room. And so I'll assign you to these breakout rooms. And so the questions are just, what is a boundary or limit that you have at work and home? And how do you honor your values and boundaries while at work? It's okay if you don't remember the exact question, but it's just discussing what are your boundaries and limits. And then also, how do you bring those boundaries and limits into the workplace? And so I'll give folks a chance just to be able to like write that down or to copy it down. If there's a kind person who's able to drop that in the chat, that's amazing too, but I'll also make sure to put it in the chat as well if someone doesn't beat me to it. Okay, thank you, Sarah. Okay, so let me go ahead and assign everyone to breakout rooms, and I see that Sarah will be putting it in the chat. So let me stop my share momentarily. Let me think. I don't think I see the breakout room option showing up.
Okay.
Yeah, is it showing up on your end, Linda?
Yes, maybe I'm the did you click the more button?
Yes, I did.
Okay, you say you want 2 per group?
Yeah, just 2 per room.
Oh, 2 per. Okay, opening the room.
Okay, perfect. So you all can click that, and I will see you all in 10 minutes.
Oh, wait. What's going on?
Okay, let me stop my share and see if that helps. Oh no, the breakout rooms are still not showing up.
No? Okay. Hold on. It's not working.
Let's see what's happening.
Because at first, they should update this. Sorry, I messed up.
No, thank you for helping. It is the technology world that we live in. Also, it is Mercury retrograde for the astrology folks out there. So, yes.
We just felt so familiar, and we just started talking, and it was so easy. Once we just got into Spanish, and it was fast and very easy, and it was very interesting because his boundary is also about, like Christina said, it was about his schedule working, and I at 5 o'clock I shut down. I'm very sure I keep my time limits. I make notes. This is what I did. I keep very straight notes and very detailed notes of what I'm doing. So make sure that everything is done, and I keep my separation between work and life. And I said, this is pretty cool. I wish I were like that. I don't work like that. I actually break if I do that. I'm actually totally different. I prefer the flexibility or going on my own way, in a way that I will answer an email at any time, but I like that flexibility. I like the option of being able to run my own schedule. I work at my own hours because I have to take advantage of the time in which my brain is actually engaged. So it can be at 2 in the morning, or it can be, in very rare occasions, at 8 in the morning. Very rare occasions. It's usually the later. But I have to take advantage of that moment in which my brain is actually working. And that's how I produce the most. And it was really interesting. But to me, the best thing was to realize how powerful the language is, because we started talking a little bit, oh yeah, what are we supposed to do here and whatever. And when we realized, wait, you speak Spanish, I speak Spanish, then it was on. We were just talking, and it was so easy. And language, maternal language, it's just such a powerful thing. And that was what I wanted to share.
Yes. No, thank you for sharing. I saw people in the chat too who were just like really enjoying what you were saying. Absolutely. There's so much power in that, like being able to connect with people, like just through language, right? Like through cultural similarities. Like it feels like coming home a little bit to be like, oh wait, like we get each other, like we're clicking. And also like what you said too about boundaries look different for different people. For you, it's that flexibility and freedom. And that's something that I definitely want folks to hold on to, because that's important. So I can take one more person and then we'll move into talking more about boundaries.
I was going to piggyback on Ada when she was talking, because some of this is kind of cultural to people's home lives. So like I grew up with 6 brothers and sisters, so I'm very loud. I know that I need to speak up to make sure that I'm heard. And then that can violate other people's boundaries because you're too loud or whatever. And you mentioned the notes on your I have notes on my screen. Voice is scary. Walls are thin. Lower your voice, to remind me that you know those boundaries exist. And it especially gets difficult when you start working on different mediums. So like your voice needs to be at a different volume if you're talking on a video with other people than it needs to be if someone's in your space 2 feet from you. And that's changed now that we're in COVID, because most of us now are communicating via Teams and Zoom and GoToMeeting, as opposed to having somebody in your room, in a room with you, or in the cube next to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for naming that. And that's real, right? Like some of the boundaries and norms that we have come from the things that we learned growing up, from our communities, from our families. Like growing up in a loud household is true. You learn how to yell and project so that you can be heard. And it's not a sign of disrespect always, but and this is what we're going to get into a lot more today and even next month, which is boundaries. It's important to know our boundaries, but it's also important to know the boundaries of the people around us. And to figure out like, what does it look like to meet people where they're at, to figure out some kind of compromise. And also thank y'all for using the chat. I definitely encourage folks to read some of the comments that are being placed here because I really enjoy it. I see that someone said that they had ADHD. I'm also part of the ADHD community. So I was just like, yes, I love to see us being represented. And so, yes, thank you all for just your wisdom and like reflection and intentionality in answering these questions. And so I want to get into the next portion because I want to make sure to give you all a 5-minute break around 11 because I firmly believe in giving people a break from screen time. And I know that our brains just automatically check out after a certain point. And that's just the science. We can't really fight against that. So exploring boundaries. It sounds like, I just want to say, y'all know a lot about boundaries. I'm not surprised considering the line of work that you all do, the way that you all operate. But with boundaries, I think the most important thing to remember is that they're based off of our values. They're extensions of core pieces of ourselves about things that we believe and that we cherish and that we care for. And we should never cross our values or our boundaries. It happens often. Like it's easy for us to say, oh, well, I can cross this boundary because it helps other people. But it can be really harmful in the long run. It can lead to burnout, like I know a few folks were saying. It can lead to moral injury and people choosing to leave the field because they haven't respected themselves or they crossed their own values at some point, or they didn't communicate their own values or boundaries. We always have to communicate our boundaries, our values, because they're important. They're who we are. They say a lot about us. And if we're diminishing ourselves, then eventually we're going to have to leave a space or we're not going to be living our life fully. We're not going to be able to fully show up for our clients, but also for ourselves or for our families. And that's the most important thing to remember is that, yes, it's true that you're doing this work for community, but you're also part of a community. You're also an individual at the end of the day. Examples are, if you like spending time with your family, you have to set firm boundaries around working late, right? Because a big thing for you, if we're looking at it from a value standpoint, is quality time with family. And so, yes, you can love giving to community, but you also have to make sure that you're respecting that thing about yourself. A big value that I have is just self-care time. Like I'm really big into just being able to pour into myself. Like my favorite thing to do is to take a nice bath after I work. Like I take a lot of baths throughout the week. Like it's ridiculous levels. And if I stop taking my bubble baths, like it's hard, like, and I have to do that. That is something that is important for me. And part of it is because water has a very symbolic representation for me. And it's very much tied to my ancestry and my ancestry through West Africa. And so I honor that. And so a bath is not just a bath, that is much more. And it's important just to think about that and to remember that for ourselves. Your boundaries are yours and yours alone. Even if someone else is like, what kind of boundary is that? That's not the point. It's important to remember that your boundaries align with you, but they also should align closely with the people that you're working with or the people that you spend time with. You should always understand what your values are and what your boundaries are before you enter a situation so that you're not uncomfortable. And so I encourage folks, I know we don't have a lot of time in this training, but I definitely encourage you all to really sit in reflection, to maybe journal about it, maybe to talk about people in your life, just about what your values and boundaries are. I don't think that we're often really asked that question. And so it's important to give yourself space to be able to ask that for yourself. And so let me just check the chat really quickly to see what's coming up, because I see a lot of comments and I really like that. So I see mindfulness. Yes, we'll be talking about mindfulness later for the person who mentioned that. Absolutely, there's no such thing as too many baths. I see West Africa representation, which is exciting. I see someone saying they value getting paid for their work and they're not, and if they're working over 40 hours a week, then they're not honoring that. Absolutely, because you're working for free. That's a value and that's a boundary. And definitely acknowledge and respect that. So I'm just gonna pause and see like what thoughts people might have before we move on. And also one thing I can do, if people are interested in exploring this more, I have this really amazing worksheet that I love doing with folks that goes into more depth about boundaries. And it has discussion questions and reflection questions. It's one of my favorite things to do with people is just to sit down with them and to go over those boundaries. So I'll make sure to give that to Linda so that it can be passed along to the rest of you all to look at that if that's something that you do want to do, and just to explore more. But moving further into this, we started talking about this, and so we don't necessarily need to answer this question, but this is something that I just wanted y'all to think on, which is boundaries oftentimes reflect our cultural backgrounds. They reflect our personal or group characteristics that we might be part of. And so just remembering that too, because honoring your boundaries is a way of honoring your community, your culture, your heritage. So for the person who mentioned mindfulness, we will be talking a lot about mindfulness today, a ton about mindfulness. And the reason why I want us to emphasize mindfulness so much is because it is a skill that can be applied in multiple different settings. It's one that I think that we often forget about because we're so busy just going. But we cannot exist in community with one another if we are not aware of ourselves, if we are not mindful, if we're not present. And so we're going to move into another breakout room. This time it'll just be for 8 minutes. And then we'll get into talking more about mindfulness. But we'll do the breakout room and then we'll do a break for 5 minutes. So I'll go ahead and stop my share. But the questions are, why is it helpful to stay present? And how are you able to stay present? Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, perfect. So if anyone's able to put that question in the chat, I definitely encourage y'all to do that. I'll also make sure to send it out to folks, but yeah, just like, why is it helpful to be mindful? Thank you for that, Hannah. So there we go. And thank you for that, Linda. I really love the community care that's happening today. So folks should join breakout rooms now. You should see it popping up on your screen. And I'm checking the rooms now to see if there's anyone who's left by themselves.
Recorded.
People are coming back slowly. I encourage folks to mute themselves as they're coming back into the space. Okay, perfect. So it looks like everyone's mostly back. So we can have two people, like if they would like to share out like just what they discussed or like things that they like noticed or observed. And then we'll go ahead and go on break for 5 minutes. But who would like to just share out like about like what they discussed or what they learned?
I can share a little bit about with our group. Just the moment of being present and being with someone. It's easy if you're not doing that for them to feel discredited or feel like there's no point in being here, especially with the clients and the population that we deal with. A lot of times there is crisis stuff going on and they're in a highly emotional state, and there's things that are going on that we have to be able to key into, and not being centered or not being mindful of what's going on with them and how they're presenting is a big challenge, and if you're not able to stay in that time, you lose out on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And I feel like that lends so well to validation, which we'll talk more about later. But yeah, absolutely. You have to stay a little grounded and present just to be able to do this work, and to be able to understand what the people that you all are working with are going through. Is there anyone else who would like to share out like how they're able to stay grounded and present, especially like just with themselves as they're working with folks?
I'll say something about that.
Yeah.
I tell people all the time that we should live in the now because we don't know the future and the past is already over. So in this situation, you would actually just be in that moment with them. And I find that absolutely important because that's where we are now. So that's why, I don't know, I just find it very important for people to come back into the now. If you're way too far in the future, it's not even here. So you're like dreaming, you're somewhere else. And I got that kind of wisdom from Eckhart Tolle, who loves to live in the now. And I love other wisdom teachers. So that situation is so important. You can definitely hear people if you're present. And that's what I have. I absolutely love being present and in the now.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I mean, that's so true. When we're thinking about the future or we're thinking about other things, we're not actually really here in those moments. It's interesting how time works. But yeah, not being present means that you're not living in the present, right? Like you're envisioning a future or you're thinking about things like all the what ifs. And it's not really good for our minds to do that. It makes it hard for us to actually feel like we're experiencing life or to really be aware of what's happening around us. I also want to make sure to read a couple of things from the chat just before we go for break. I see that someone put there that they try to find ways to remain present, and that their experiences, identities have a big impact on how they perceive life situations. So they try to remind themselves to be empathetic. Thank you all for the names too that you all are dropping about people who talk about this. Deep breathing absolutely is helpful. Meditation, yes. I love the wisdom present in this space throughout the morning. And so we'll get more into mindfulness and how to use it like as a way to just like what it is, how to use it in terms of being aware of your own emotional state, especially because of the work that you all do in these crisis situations. But what I'm going to do is give you all a 5-minute break. And so we'll be back at 11:14, but just like a chance to use the restroom, grab some water, whatever you need to do so that we can get into the final stretch for this training. So see you all in 5 minutes. Okay, so folks should be coming back to this space. Yeah, so as we come back into this space, either turning your camera on, doing a emoji to let me know that you're present. Yes, whatever it needs to be, but just letting me know that you're here. Also, thank you for the note, like if anyone's having any issues with hearing in the breakout rooms. It's totally okay that there was no sound on the timer. I was honestly just impressed that the timer was there. I love it. But we'll go ahead and get into the rest of what we'll be covering for today. And so a lot of it will be utilizing mindfulness skills, and just as a gentle reminder for folks, remembering that these are just foundational skills to apply to how we exist with one another, and honor each other's cultural differences, or also even sexual orientation, gender, religious differences, whatever it might be. But just remembering to like making that connection of these are foundational skills that will apply to more skills that we will cover next month that will be much more focused specifically on equity and naming equity more intentionally. So with that, let me go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint and we can jump back into it. So let me stop my share, sorry. Let me see what's going on with that. There we go. So let me exit full screen and now share it. Sorry, everyone, I'm using a Mac and I'm more of a PC person, but very proud of myself that I figured it out in one morning. There we go. So mindfulness 101. So I know that we talk about mindfulness a lot. I know that it's something that is big. I know that it is really common, especially with a lot of therapists and caregivers and people who just do community work in general, to talk about mindfulness. I'm a big fan of it myself, but I wanted to just like give you all resources to cover mindfulness in a way that is more digestible and broken up into smaller chunks. And so I will go ahead and go into the presentation. So the biggest thing to remember with mindfulness is that it's about being intentional and living with awareness in the present moment, which a lot of folks were touching on as we were discussing some of the questions from the breakout rooms. It's also about attachment to the present moment, which sounds very hard, but I think a lot of it is letting go of those judgments, right? It's recognizing that, yes, this is a moment, and a moment is not necessarily meant to last forever. It's also removing those judgments or the rejection of that moment. And so the best example I could think of, if we're to talk about rejection of a moment, is maybe it's Wednesday morning and you have to do a 2-hour training for work. And maybe you don't want to be up early on a Wednesday morning doing a 2-hour training for work. If we reject that moment, it makes it much harder to deal with. And yes, I know I am talking about the training that we're doing right now, but it's just recognizing that. And I definitely know that sometimes it can be hard to be present in the moment, especially if it's a moment that we maybe don't always want. But that judgment or rejection can make it hard for us to be fully present and mindful. And it can also impact our mood a lot. And so I'll go more into mindfulness, but a lot of these skills that I'm talking about, I always like to honor where I learned some of the things that I use. And so some people might find this familiar. It's a lot of DBT language. And that's mostly because DBT has broken down mindfulness in a way that I haven't really seen a lot of other sources do. And so DBT is just dialectical behavioral therapy for anyone who's interested. That's one of my therapy trainings that I am most trained in and what I use the most. And so if anyone ever notices I'm saying certain things, they're like, that sounds like DBT. It probably is DBT since I am immersed in it often. But mindfulness, just breaking it down and just being able to discuss it in small chunks. So let me see. DBT is great. Yes. I'm glad that we have some DBT fans in the space. But going more into what mindfulness is, it's just observing inside and outside of yourself, right? It's that wordless watching. And so I think that for some of us, mindfulness might come easier. It sometimes it's easier also to be able to observe outside of ourselves, but I encourage folks to also observe what's happening within yourself, like whether it's an emotion or a thought, whether it's a physical sensation. But I firmly believe that if we are not able to observe what's happening within ourselves, especially as people who are engaged in really important work, work that takes a lot of energy, like mentally and physically, if we're not observing our own selves, it can lead to burnout. If you're not observing what's happening within you, that means that you're not honoring your own boundaries or values. And so mindfulness is the foundational skill for all of the skills in life. And it starts with observing, not labeling it, just watching. And so that next step is just describing it, right? So now we're putting words to it. We're not putting judgments in place. And judgments usually, it's a judgment if it's something like should. If you're telling yourself you should do this thing, or if it feels like an absolute, like black and white, like very extreme sort of thought, like I am bad, or whatever it might be, right? Or this is like, if it feels very judgmental, or it feels like it's an absolute that doesn't leave any kind of flexibility in there, that's how you know that you might be stepping into judgmental thoughts. And it's okay, like our brains are going to do it. I've seen stats that say like 80% of our thoughts each day are negative, and we have thousands and thousands of thoughts. And so it's really hard to avoid it. It just is human nature. It's what enables us to survive because we have to recognize dangerous situations. It's why we've been here for so long on this earth. But those judgments can make it hard to fully show up and be present because we get wrapped up in them. And so it's important when you're trying to describe what's happening around you to remove those judgments. And that's huge for this sort of work, especially we might have clients who are dealing with some really difficult situations, and maybe we're frustrated and we're wondering why they're not doing the thing that seems like the best path, or if it feels like they're failing over and over again in these situations. Those frustrations are valid and real, and adding judgments into it doesn't help with us helping people. And so it's always important just to remember to observe and to describe. If it's not something that, like in that observing, like when you're describing this, if it's not something that you can observe through your senses, then you cannot describe it. And that includes people's thoughts, because we don't know what other people are thinking. That includes other people's emotions, because we are not able to see other people's emotions. We only know what is being communicated to us. And so never making assumptions or judgments, just describing the facts of what is happening in that moment. And then engage, right? Like if we're in community, we're supporting people or we're doing case management work, we have to be engaged. We have to throw ourselves into that moment and to go with that flow, to do what's necessary, not what we think we should be doing. Let me see some of the comments. I'm going to pause and just see what other people are saying. I see someone said, use words that do not have negative connotations for the moment. Yes. It should always be something that's accurate. Like a good way of thinking about this is if you have food in your fridge and you smell it and the first thought is this food is bad, I would say like, that's true, but technically why is it bad? It's because the food's rotten. That's the more accurate label, right? And that's just like a small example, but it's always remembering that, like when we start to label things, it's like, is this the actual thing that's happening? Or is it that we've made some kind of shortcut in our brain and now we're using the word bad instead of the word rotten? Judgment as should. Yeah, such a great watchword. Yeah, I've seen some people use the term don't should all over yourself. I think it's funny. It always makes me laugh every time I hear that, but I think it's pretty accurate. If you're shoulding all over yourself, you're not going to feel great. Like, oh, I should be doing this or I should be doing that. It's like, oh, now you're judging yourself. And then you start judging your judging. And then it's a cycle that happens, a spiral. And so I see another comment that says, wherever you go, you are the moment you're in. It's not about getting you anywhere. It's making the moment. Absolutely. I also like, one thing I like about mindfulness, I think it's a way to be able to control time a little bit. If you're feeling miserable and you're watching the clock constantly, that time is going to go so much slower versus if you just experience the moment and just participate and engage and go with the flow. And when I say go with the flow, I don't mean be easy. I mean, go with the flow of that moment. And so if you're in a situation and people are engaged in a protest against injustice, that doesn't mean don't go with the protest if that's your values. It's more going with what is necessary. And a lot of it connects back to our own boundaries and values, but also recognizing like, how do you honor yourself in this moment by staying present in a way that honors you? I also see some, the shooting yourself. Yeah, thank you all for saying that. I just love the resources that have been in this space throughout this morning. And so this is just like some of the mindfulness skills broken down. It works, I promise. I used to be like, there's no way, but it really does. And so one thing I'll make sure to do is I'll send these slides out to people. I am not someone who sits on things and doesn't give it to people. It's a resource. So you all are welcome to be able to look at this. I can even give you all the handouts that I pulled this information from originally, but it is very, very helpful and applies to so many different contexts. And so expanding on mindfulness, that's just like what mindfulness is, right? Like if you're being mindful, if you're being present in the moment, you're noticing what's happening around you. You're able to actually describe what's happening around you. You're able to engage with what's happening around you. But how do you practice mindfulness? You have to be non-judgmental. You have to remove the judgments, right? And judgments are helpful to a certain extent. Like I would never tell a person of color who's worried about being in an area where maybe they see signals that show that people believe in, I don't know, like white supremacy. Like if you're in an area and you see like Confederate flags, I think it is fair to be a little concerned, and that is not necessarily being non-judgmental. I think the point of being non-judgmental is being able to pause and to ask yourself, what are the facts of this situation and what is actually happening, right? And why did my brain go to where it went? It's being aware of yourself and also aware of whatever interpretations that you might be forming. Doesn't mean that all interpretations are wrong. It's more that a lot of interpretations are important to have. They're a survival mechanism, they're instinctual, but also we need to know why we have them so that we're not being controlled by our emotions or our instincts, but instead we're able to actually control our emotions, right? Because our emotions are just one part of us. Our reactions and our behaviors are just one part of us. And so it's being non-judgmental. It's also being one mindful, not multitasking, which I know is so hard in this work. In fact, I'm actually multitasking right now, looking at the chat. Thank you for that comment, James. But for the most part, no creature on this earth multitasks generally. What I love about my cat and watching her, when she's napping, she's napping. When she's meowing at me, she's meowing. When she's eating her kibble, that's what she's doing. Like she's just being a cat and doing one thing in the moment and just existing. And thank you for that, Steph. Hope you have a good rest of your day as you're signing off. But multitasking just generally doesn't work. For the people who are coders in here, we often think that computers multitask. They don't. When you have one tab pulled up in that moment, that's the one thing that computer is doing. It's not like if you have 10 tabs pulled open, those 10 tabs are not all working at the same time. The one that you have actively open in that moment is the one that's working. It's just that computers are able to switch between tasks very quickly to the point that we don't realize it. And so the human brain is the same way. Like for some of us, we can switch between tasks and that's great, but we cannot do two things at the same time because something will be dropped. And also it makes it so that we don't feel as present. And so staying one mindful. And then just do what's necessary or helpful for the situation. And when I say the situation, it also includes you. It's not do what's helpful for this one person and this one thing. It's do what's necessary for this situation. So it's looking at the full picture. It's being effective in the long run. And also not just reacting to that one moment, but recognizing that our behaviors influence our future. And so we have to be very intentional in the moment. But I'm just gonna pause and see like any like questions folks may have, like any thoughts. Yeah, I think I like that comment about having too many tabs open slows the computer down and they can crash. It's true. Computers were created by people and we created them to work similarly to how we work. But any questions, any thoughts before we move on? I know it's a lot of information and I always feel like it's kind of nebulous. and not as concrete, which gets interesting. Mindfulness is very much some of those things that feels kind of slippery, like trying to grasp it. Yeah, context switching, absolutely. Yeah, there's no one size fits all for any of these things. It really comes down to the context and the situation. So I'll go ahead then and move into the next section. And so it's just expanding upon mindfulness. Except this time we're going to apply it to a specific thing, which is emotions. And so I love talking about emotions. I love thinking about like how emotions influence us. I think that in a perfect world, I think people wish that they were just completely driven by logic and rationality only, but that is not how humans work. We have emotions. We have two parts of our brain. We have the prefrontal cortex, which is great, very logical, very rational, gets things done, enables us to have jobs. But we also have the amygdala and the limbic system, and that's the older part of the brain that ensures that we survive. And that part of the brain will not go away. In fact, it's necessary. And so it's really about recognizing that that is an integral part of you and that emotions have reasons for being there. We have them so that we can survive, so that we can recognize what's going on in situations. It's just hardwired into the body. So let me look at the chat. Cool. So knowing that emotions are always going to be there, it means that there's no magical switch to flip off your emotions when you clock in for work or when you're working with clients or out in the field or doing whatever it is you might be doing. Emotions are still going to be there. And if we're not aware of our emotions, that can be a little dangerous because we might think that we're operating from a very logical place. And that's not what's happening because the emotions are sneaking in and saying, hey, I'm logic. And actually, surprise, it's an emotion that's tricking you into thinking that you're operating from a rational place. And there's nothing wrong with reacting to your emotions, but it's just being aware of them so that your emotions are not running you. So instead of moving into breakout rooms for these questions, I'm just curious to see like if anyone wants to like, anyone has any thoughts about this, if they want to put it in the chat, if they want to answer it out loud. But the questions are just like, why might it be helpful to be mindful of your emotions? And also, how do you practice being mindful and aware of your emotions? Yeah, emotions do lead to gut feelings about situations. Absolutely important. If you're getting a fear response, it's important to understand why that's happening. But yeah, does anyone have any thoughts about like just how they're able to be mindful of their emotions or why it's important?
I'm going to go out on a limb here. So for those of us who've had trauma in our lives, sometimes our emotions are triggered by past events. And so being mindful of our emotions doesn't allow those past events and feelings to interfere with our current situation. So that's why it's important or helpful to be mindful of our emotions, because it gives us a context so that we don't overreact or underreact depending on what our experience with those feelings are.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, absolutely. You're spot on with that one. A lot of us are like, I will say this, right? Like every single person on this planet has experienced some kind of trauma of some sort. Like it just is. It doesn't mean that we all have PTSD. It just means that at some point we experienced something that did not feel that great. It may have been mildly embarrassing or traumatic or harmful or hurtful in some way. Because at some point someone told us no, maybe we were invalidated, maybe we got embarrassed at school. And we've all been through the education system, which means we at some point experienced some kind of trauma. And so knowing that, that means that we are always going to have some sort of reaction based off of our previous experiences, right? And so an emotion might come up because your brain has made a link between the situation you're in and a situation you were in the past. And sometimes that's applicable and it's important to be like, oh, wait, I learned this lesson before. But sometimes the brain is just making a connection and you're not in the same situation. And so you don't need to, yell at your boss because you're being misunderstood. And so it is so important to be aware of your emotions so that they don't control you. And also so that you're able to empathize and connect with others. And to also be able to take care of yourself. Because if you're noticing anger or fear or sadness or whatever it might be coming up, or even if you're noticing joy, it's asking yourself this question of, oh, why is this coming up? Like, how can I engage with this emotion? What do I need to do to tend to it? And how can I show up fully in my work? And so let me just pause because I want to touch on a comment that was put in the chat by Jessica. It says, I named my anxious amygdala Karen after the famous emu on YouTube, and it is helpful to remind myself that Karen and my amygdala are doing their best, but they're not great making decisions on their own. I love that. And I like that you gave your amygdala a name. That's really smart. And I might have to note that and just mention it to people like, yeah, it's a part of you, right? It has a name. And for some of us, like we might have a really strong response. And instead of looking at it as a deficit, being like, wow, my brain and my body knows how to make sure I survive. Like if I was put in a dangerous situation, I would make it out. Like, yes, the anxiety feels tough in a moment, but it's a strength, right? Because it means that you're aware of dangerous situations and you can respond in that moment. I also see that Clarice said emotional awareness can help us identify and regulate our intentions, be active in our interactions, and uphold our values and needs. Yes, that's exactly what it is. And that's huge because this work is emotion work. And so we always have to be aware of our emotions, especially because y'all are dealing with, y'all are working with people who are experiencing a crisis. They're in survival mode and their emotions are high. There's no way that we're not going to pick up that energy in some way or absorb that a little bit. And so you have to be mindful of your emotions in those moments so that you're not inadvertently, having like transference or countertransference or harming others. And it's okay to have an emotional response, but it's just being aware of that response so that you're able to navigate the situation in the workplace, especially if you're dealing with something that's really difficult. Like if someone says something that feels harmful racially, being able to recognize like, oh, wait a second, I feel, harmed, or like, I feel like I'm experiencing some sort of trauma, and being able to name that so you know how to proceed forward with that situation. So mindfulness of emotions. Yes, absolutely. That is a skill. Pause and take a breath. I do that constantly. If we had more time, I would share some stories about how I've dealt with discrimination or like people like microaggressions or like full-on aggressions, like how I've handled those situations because it's been interesting. But it's doing the same skills around mindfulness. Like you have to observe them, right? And experience them sometimes. There are some moments where we cannot fully experience our emotion because we have to be present with people. And so it's just recognizing that you're going to tuck it away and come back to it as soon as you can. Because I think that in that tucking away of the emotion, we sometimes forget that it's there and then it unearths itself at the worst moment. So always come back to that emotion and tend to it. Don't suppress it. Don't try to amplify it, which can sometimes happen. Just experience it, like breathe into the emotion, feel them. So there's a reason why we call feelings feelings. It's because they're in the body. Notice where it's showing up physically, whether it's your chest or it's your stomach, wherever it is. For some people, they have body aches and pains. I remember I was at a job doing community organizing, and I was super excited and fresh out of school, and it was just, in the work, like in the trenches. And I was so achy. I would wake up in pain and wouldn't be able to walk, and I had no idea what was going on. No doctor could figure it out. And then I started to engage in self-care. Eventually, I left that job, and the pain left too. And so it's important to think about, where are your feelings at in your body? What are your feelings trying to tell you? And how can you tend to that? And how can you accept your emotions? Because they're part of being human. We have to love them. We have to respect them because they're never going to go away. And there's also nothing wrong with emotions. If you didn't have emotions, you wouldn't be able to feel happiness or joy when the sun comes out in the PNW. We wouldn't have fun summer experiences without our emotions. So I'm just going to pause because I know I've been talking a lot. Just see what thoughts people might have before we move into the last big chunk of what we'll be talking about for today.
Makayala, Megan here. I was just typing in the chat, but figured it'd be quicker to say it. I was just thinking about kind of what people were bringing up too, but with being mindful and like recognizing our emotions for me, and I think other people are like that, or people are kind of half and half, but like sometimes I need a day or two to process if something really emotionally impacted me. And that's totally okay. And I think other people are really this like, I need to have a conclusion right now, or we need to talk about this right now. And I think like that's where our emotions really relate to like boundary setting too, is like it can feel like we can get pressure from other people to not feel a certain way, or like that our feelings may not be valid, or like the way we take care of ourselves. And I think that that's really important when thinking about emotions, is also like the boundary setting of like, it's okay for me to feel what I feel, and take time to like kind of process that before having a discussion. And I feel like I've struggled a lot with that over the years, and I know other people do too. So that made me really think of that between the two.
Yes. No, thank you for that, Megan. Because you're exactly right. And there's no wrong or right way to experience your emotions. It just is, right? For some of us, it takes a little longer. For others, they react immediately. But the one thing I would say about both camps of people is that if you're trying to have an important conversation with someone you love, you should never do it from a place of feeling emotionally overwhelmed. Or like if you like, and you can typically tell if you're in this overwhelmed place, if it's hard to think clearly, if you're like shaky or sweaty, or like your mind is just like screaming at you, like whatever it might be. Like if you're noticing like these physical signs of distress, take a break, take care of yourself, regroup, have a conversation between you and your body and your emotions, and then come back. I think sometimes we assume that we have to resolve the thing in the moment or else it'll just go away. But that's connected to mindfulness, right? Because we're so attached to a moment that we're not fully present and aware of what we actually need to do for ourselves. And so I always say that. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's kind of like that thing where, you hear that trope of people getting in an argument and they're like, oh, I wish I would have said that, like days later. I think about that a lot of like, I'm going to be more present for that conversation and have a better sense because I'm in fight or flight right now. And I really want to be like grounded. And that takes a lot of work. So I often think of that, like it is okay to take a couple days because you're probably going to have a better interaction as well. And that's kind of different, but it is mindfulness, like you said, of like, I'm not being mindful if I'm responding right away because my emotions are in a certain place. But if I take a day or two, then I'm going to be better able to show up in that space.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. You're absolutely correct. And so this applies as well to like conversations in the workplace, like around equity, and other things, right? Because at the end of the day, what's happening is it's some form of invalidation, or it's emotions, right? Because these are important things. We're talking about lives. We're talking about identities. We're talking about ourselves and who we are in our communities. And so these conversations are not easy to have. It's not something that can always be embraced in the moment. I will never forget a situation where someone did use a racial slur while I was at a conference. And instead of immediately yelling at this person, we went into racial caucusing, and we had conversations. We unpacked what was coming up for us. We came up with a plan on how to address this and talk to this person. And then much later in the day, we had a few people from that group come together and talk to this person and call this person in. It was honestly one of the most powerful moments that I've seen. And so it just lets me know, like with conflict, like we have to be intentional about how we have these conversations so that we can actually be able to be heard, so that we can be validated, and so that we can also continue to engage in relationship if we need to. And so I love all these comments in the chat, like what people are saying. Y'all are amazing. And so let me go ahead and move into this last chunk since I know that we're getting a little close to time. But this last piece is validation, and it's mindful listening. And so validation helps us to feel connected to others, to problem solve, to remove that defensiveness and that anger and I need to be right. And it helps us to increase the empathy. And so a lot of us aren't really taught about what validation is. We're not really taught the importance of it, but we have to validate people. And so an example I could think of is say you're escalated, maybe you're mad, like maybe someone said something to you and they say, calm down, as you're clearly escalated. Are you going to calm down in that moment, or are you going to feel more elevated and more upset? Most likely you're going to be like, I am calm, right? And it's clearly going to be like, it's not going to help. And this isn't because people are trying to hurt you. It's not because they're trying to invalidate you. It's just that when people are experiencing a lot of emotions or whatever it might be, and your response is to say your emotion is wrong, it's going to make the person feel more and more upset. And so in order to de-escalate a situation, usually the thing that helps the most is actually validation. And I've seen people struggle with that where they're like, I'm not trying to sugarcoat things. I'm like, I'm not saying to sugarcoat things. I'm saying validate things that are real, to actually see the person, to recognize that you're talking to a human being. And that the path forward involves recognizing and connecting with this person on some level, whatever it might be. That doesn't mean validating the invalid. Because if someone says something that's wrong, that's like discriminatory, then that thing is wrong. It just is. So with validation, I actually have a handout that I'll make sure to send to you all around this, because it's actually very, very helpful. I swear it's like a cheat code. It's amazing how well it works. If you all know anyone in your life who you consider to be like where you feel like you have to be careful with your words constantly, or it feels like you're constantly tiptoeing around this person, validation is the key to talking to this person. Hands down. It's interesting because I think we often assume that that's not the most helpful thing to do, but it actually is. The way that people will melt and like turn into their best versions of themselves, if you actually see them, is phenomenal. Like, I can't get over it. It's ridiculous how well it works. It also makes our lives better as well, because we feel better. We're helping, we're connecting with people. And also we're able to do the thing that we wanted to do, which is problem solve probably. And so just going through this step by step, how to be mindful and listening and how to validate others. You have to understand the person. If you have to put yourself in that person's place, then do so, to be like, wait a second, if someone was to come up to me and said that I'm bad at my job, how would I feel or react? Like, if you have to do that and put yourself in that person's position, then do that. Whatever it takes to fully understand what this person is going through, so that you can understand like why they're having the response they have, is helpful, because every behavior has a cause. People are not just doing things just randomly. Every behavior has a cause, whether we understand that cause, whether we think that cause is valid, it doesn't matter. There's still an explanation behind why people do what they do. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it. It just is. It's also helpful to be able to show understanding and acceptance by nonverbal behaviors, right? Like tone of voice, facial expression, gestures, like eye contact. The eye contact one really depends on the culture. And I will say this, a lot of the things I'm talking about are very much of a Western perspective, because I was born and raised and socialized in the US. And so I would say for folks where that's not their cultural context, take what makes sense for you, but don't take other ones. Because sometimes eye contact might be seen as a sign of disrespect. And so that's also okay. But it's just those nonverbals, like whatever it looks like to show that you are paying attention to a person, just doing that. Also just like restating what people are saying, like the most important thoughts, the things that you're hearing, so that you can tell them like, hey, I hear you. Show equality and support. Like, don't fragilize or one up other people. Oftentimes we'll try to withhold information because you don't want to hurt people's feelings. And I understand why we do that, but that's dangerous because there's so much that's being unsaid. They're only getting a piece of the truth. And also it's fragilizing them. If we're holding this information, why do we assume that they cannot? And also just validate the valid. Emotions are valid. All behaviors have a cause. And then read minds, like what isn't being said? What do you already know about this person? This doesn't mean guessing, but it's really just recognizing that if you're talking to someone who's experienced a significant amount of trauma, just remember that. It's not being stated, but it's important. It's a part of that person's history. And that's influencing their behaviors. So let me pause. Yes, I'll make sure to send that validation handout. fun fact, I use it the most with people who are trying to have good communication with their spouses, which I really like and think is really cute. But is there a distinction between words versus nonverbal? Yes, there is. We communicate in a lot of different ways. A lot of times people pick up on nonverbals, whether they're intentionally aware of it or not. And so it's important that even if you're not saying words, that you're also paying attention to your nonverbals, like your facial expressions, your tone of voice, and your body language. That doesn't mean changing yourself, because I, for example, I'm a very kind of flat, like monotonish sort of speaker by nature. But I'm still able to shift my voice somewhat so that people are able to pick up on what it is I'm trying to communicate to them. And so it's just working with what you have. And also just being very careful about what your nonverbals are communicating to them. Because if you're sitting like this with your arms crossed as someone is, asking you for help, it might not be a good communication that you're giving across. And also it's important, yes, to make a distinction between feelings and behaviors, because you can feel sad and not show it externally. Behaviors are the physical communication that we're giving to people. You can have a feeling or emotion that's happening and not act on it or behave on it. So there's absolutely a difference between the two. So let me just go to this next one. So I'll pause now because this is the final step, or the final stage. But I just want to see like what questions, what thoughts people might have. And actually, let me see if I can go back to the previous slide and sit on that for a second. And for folks who are taking notes, I promise we'll make sure to send this out so that you all have access to it. Yes, and I'll also make sure to provide this information as well next month. So, yeah. Okay, no questions or concerns. So we'll go ahead and move on. Let me just check the chat really quickly. Thank you. So let me go ahead and move on to the next one, which is the building blocks.
Question,
right?
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
My question is, what if someone says that they're fine, but their like behavior or their like nonverbal cues suggest that they aren't, and like how do you navigate that in a workspace, but when you have to collaborate?
That's a good question. It comes down to respecting that person's boundaries, right? And so if they don't want to talk about it, they don't. But we also have agency and autonomy, and we could say, hey, like, yeah, like, you don't want to talk about it, that's okay. I just wanted to let you know that, like, I've just been noticing that, like, you might, like, your nonverbals are like showing me that maybe you're upset or like something's going on. I don't know what it is. Maybe I'm misreading it, but I just want to double check because I care about you, right? It's not being accusatory. It's remembering to use those I statements and just saying, like, here's what I'm noticing. Like, and maybe like they'll choose to open up, maybe they won't. But it's important to acknowledge these things and to say, like, I'm noticing that this is coming up, and not to just let it simmer, which I know that we often do because we don't want to offend people. But would you be offended if someone said, I care about you? Maybe not. Maybe they would. And if they are, they'll tell you. But yeah, that's a really good question to ask. And it's something I face a lot. Like, as a therapist, I have to just ask outright, like, what's going on with people. And I do the same thing at work too. Like, I'll tell people, like, hey, I'm noticing something. And they can choose to do with that what they will. But we can also go over those sort of situations more next month as well. So setting the stage, the building blocks, productive conversations, and using mindfulness, validation, boundaries, values, right? So I know that's the heart of this, is how do we have these conversations? How do we talk to one another? Sometimes it's easier to talk to people that have similarities because there's already unspoken norms and group agreements that are present. And so it just makes it so much easier because there's already some understanding that's there. It gets complicated when we add in all of the elements of people's identities, when we start talking about intersectionality and all these other pieces. And so it's important to just have these basic skills of validation, being mindful of self and others, and also knowing your boundaries and values, but also giving people a chance to speak about their boundaries and values, because that is how we're able to have healthy conversations. That is how we're able to connect with one another, and to repair harm, because this is always the hardest thing to say. And I say this to people, I know people don't like it. Conflict is inevitable. It will happen. It is part of existing, because people do get hurt because we have emotions and we have needs. It just is. The conflict, it just depends on what the conflict might be, but it will happen. And we all know this. For anyone who grew up with siblings, think about how often you argue with your siblings. Often, I imagine, right? Because conflict is one of those things that just happens. I think what we have to figure out is, how do we deal with conflict, right? Because conflict is just communicating that my boundaries or my emotions or something has been crossed at some point. And so it is possible to repair that. The repair might look like continuing to exist in a relationship with this person. It might look like you don't continue to exist with this person because your values are just too different. Neither is wrong, but there is still a way to fix it without it turning into this huge thing that is hard to navigate. Yeah, that's true. Someone said, I heard that if there is no conflict, there's also a lack of diversity and point of view. That is actually true, yeah. It means that you have people who either fully agree with you or they're afraid to speak up. And both can be an issue. So questions to think about, like, what is a productive conversation? What's a healthy conversation? Conversations take work and understanding. They take learning certain skills. We spend so much time learning about like how to write, how to read, and we don't really spend a lot of time learning how to exist as people, but we need to. And so this is setting the stage, right? Like the bottom line of just what we covered for today is that boundaries and values are our foundation. Mindful listening and validation are key to any relationship, whether it's a professional one or a personal one. But I always think about is in romantic relationships, people sit down at some point and typically have a conversation about the things that they care about and who they are. And we have to do the same for every single relationship that we're in. Also, our emotions are important and they influence us. And we have to be aware of our reality and also our needs. We can't leave that at the door when we walk into work. We still have to be aware that we are people who are in work and that there are some things that are just non-negotiables, like turning off your phone at 5 p.m. because you want to be with your family. So yeah, this is all I have for today. I just want to say thank you all for listening, for being willing to deal with the breakout rooms and some of the issues that we ran into, and being present on a Wednesday in January. I know it's been a busy time period for a lot of people, that you all are already doing a lot of work, but I'm deeply appreciative of you all and also just your engagement.
Thank you, Makayala. Thank you all for being present. I'm going to send the PDF, and also there will be a recording to Warren and whatever resources. And Warren and the planning team are storing these resources for you all to have access to them whenever you need them, not just through email, but in a secure place. And if you all have any questions that come up from this training or things that you really, really feel need to be addressed in the next training, please send them to me in the next week or so, and I'll forward that to Makayala, so they'll make sure to mention it in the next training. So I'll see you next month. The next one is February 23rd, same time. You don't have to register again. Use the same Zoom link.